I'm powysdewhurst from Toronto, from Ontario. I wish I could tell you my favorite memory of Norman Jewison, but unfortunately, I never met Norman Jewison. I've been adjacent to Norman Jewison. I've worked at his Canadian Film Center. I've, studied him. I produced and curated an event, a Lifetime Achievement Award for Norman Jewison, in combination with the University of Toronto Lifetime Achievement Award, because I sensed that the end was near, and I wanted to give him some acknowledgement, not just simply as a Canadian filmmaker, but somebody who stood for something, social justice, who stood up for, he had a voice. And what I respect about many of these folks who came from an earlier era, people like Stanley Kramer, and others, is people who spoke up. Joe Mankiewicz is another one. People who spoke up when they didn't have to. I began at the Canadian Film Center as a student volunteer back in the 90s. I was this young green kid from the Caribbean, but it was a place I always admired. I think, a place I looked up to, and a place that I always wanted the very best for. I always wanted it to push beyond what it was into, what it always hoped to be. My first experience with Jewison was with A Soldier Story. I come from a time, I have an extensive movie collection, but collecting, movies on Laserdisc and VHS and Blu-ray and, all of it, DVD, A Soldier Story, but knowing his work, knowing everything from, Fiddle on the Roof and In the Heat of the Night and Gaily Gaily and, all of these great films, even the stuff he did with, Tony Curtis back in the day, Rollerball and Moonstruck, Agnes of God, etc. Hurricane, of course. He was a guy that the public didn't necessarily know, which is something that always irked me a little bit, is the public didn't know who Norman Jewison was. They knew his work, but they didn't know Norman Jewison in the same way that you could say Steven Spielberg or Alfred Hitchcock, or in terms of the auteur, I suppose even John Huston to some degree. There were certain directors that were recognizable by their name, by their brand. Oliver Stone, George Lucas, Cecil B. DeMille. The through line with Norman Jewison was social justice, music. He began with music, with some of the live shows that he did with Belafonte. Social justice pops up throughout all of his, a good section, a cross-section of his films. The Landlord that he does with Hal Ashby, produces Hal Ashby. He touches on all of these things throughout the years. And that's something that was clearly important to him. But even more impressive was 1971 was the worst year for movies. Studios were on the verge of bankruptcy, right? So 1946, post-World War, that was the salad days of the movie industry, right? It was wonderful. But there was a progressive decline in attendance, I suppose partly due to TV and changing tastes in the 60s. Hollywood was a little slow to catch up with what, the movie-going public wanted in the 60s. So some of the musicals started dying. Right? I mean, you had hit musicals in the 60s, or early 60s, West Side Story, My Fair Lady, Mary Poppins, Sound of Music, obviously. But then by the tail end of the 60s, the interest in a lot of musicals, exception of Oliver in 69, started waning. Paint Your Wagon was a huge failure, and some of the others were dying. So in 71, Jewison, even though Fiddle on the Roof was a hit on stage, there was no guarantee that it would be a hit, on screen. But he made it work. I respect the man for what he stood for. I never got to meet him, unfortunately. Norman Jewison, it would have been great to have gotten more sort of inside of him, to get to know him better. So that's my only regret. But I respect that he was here, and I respect him for what he did, what he stood for.